Hi, everyone. Welcome to Project Hindsight Labs. I'm Michael Weatherburn, founder of this organization and the host of these events. These events are founded for a very particular purpose, which is to get people together who are interested in history and decision making and evidence. Very targeted, focused questions with experts who can really tell us how we can best make use of history in particular ways. And today, our special guest is Professor Glen O'Hara. Thanks for joining us, Glen. Glenn is
That's quite all
Professor
right.
of Modern and Contemporary History at Oxford Brookes University. He has written a number of books, I think five, on policy, politics, mostly in post-war Britain, though one of them going back to 1600, the first golden age of England, as sometimes people call it. He also has written widely in the broader media, such as Guardian, Independent, and most recently has written a very penetrating article on the future of UK higher education sector for Prospect magazine, which some of you, I'm sure, will have read. And the purpose of this discussion is principally about the upcoming UK general election, though, of course, it will be great if we can broaden this out maybe to other countries. We're in the year of democracy right now, and also governance more generally. How do senior figures use history in decision making? So without further ado, Glenn, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to talk. All of you, will hopefully be comforted to hear that I'm not going to talk for very long, because I've got some notes, and we want to hear from you, and also we want to have a discussion rather than a diatribe of me. You can read plenty that I've written, and you don't need to read much more. But just to introduce myself, yes, I've written lots about policy and public policy, and I've written a lot about incoming Labour governments, which is what we're here to talk about today. Perhaps the first initial moves of a Starmer Labour government in 10, 11 days' time. I've not just worked in academia, I've worked in other sectors as well, do plenty of journalism. I used to be a journalist, and briefly I used to be a school teacher, so I've been outside what Charles Clarke probably would have called under New Labour the ivory tower. So I've got some experience in other sectors as well. And one thing to reflect on, I think, where I would start is how interesting it is that history has turned back towards economic policy and economic history ever since the 2007, 2008 Great Recession and the near second Great Depression. Now, I think, and lots of groups working on that, like History and Policy in London and Cage at Warwick, and there's more and more interest in what might work and what might not work so well in different contexts in economic policy. But I think really the Great Recession stimulated another interest in economic history, because so many of the players were economic historians. If we think about Gordon Brown with his PhD in Red Clydeside, think about Ben Bernanke, who worked on long-term business cycles. These were the people who really decided we've got to underpin demand at all costs. And this, I suppose, is the so-called return of Keynes, which Lord Skidelsky has written a lot about, and the way in which there was a huge rejection of the consensus as it had arisen perhaps in mid-1970s onwards. And it's interesting from that Nick Macpherson, who was permanent secretary at the Treasury for a decade over that period, he said, and I'm looking at my notes so I can quote, when it comes to economic policy making, history is probably the best guide that there is. So there it is from the top, from the Treasury, thinking that. And of course, lots of people in Whitehall and Westminster, they don't have economics degrees. They've got PPE degrees, infamously, or like me, they've got a history degree. And just to start today, another 7 or 8 minutes, I thought I'd reflect on 4 things I would say to an incoming Labour government were I the kind of Alec Cairncross talking to Jim Callaghan in October 1964 and advising him. And the first is there's a real demand and importance not to spook the markets too much early on, which, of course, going back to Gordon Brown, that was one of his lessons that he took from previous Labour governments, which is don't have a crash first and then try and build up slowly on the fiscal side, and also establish monetary credibility. The second would be, leave policy tourism on your holidays. Don't go around the world saying, oh, we need to be like Finland in our schools, and we need to be like France in industrial and transport planning. I mean, each area of economic and industrial policy has got its own appropriateness to the British policy space, if I can put it like that. The third thing is, I think that political consensus and political big victories, as Labour might win a big victory a couple of weeks from now, they tend to rely on quite vague impressions, tropes, ideas. One of them is that public sector now is in chaos, and another trope we have now in our minds is Britain is underinvested on the capital side. Now, although both those things might be true, that's not really a prescription. Just spend more, invest more is not a great answer, especially when you're quite indebted, not as indebted as some countries, but quite indebted. And I think the last lesson I would take, were I talking to Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer, in the unlikely world that was true, would be to kind of try and stay heterodox, to kind of think, well, how could I stay light-footed? How could I not connect the insights I have now, which is, reform the planning system, build more houses, which is a perfectly reasonable insight, to perhaps a very different situation 7 or 8 years hence. So just to go through those in a couple of minutes, you remember, those of you who are historians, the Harold Wilson, the Gnomes of Zurich, after the ill-fated late 1964 budget under Jim Callaghan, when Labour came in, increased benefits, abolished prescription charges, increased pensions, and it's safe to say that the markets didn't like that. And Reeves and Starmer are going to have to think, especially if they have a really huge majority, as is possible. We don't know what's going to happen, but as is possible, that the bond market might get jitters. Say there's a Labour majority over 200. That might cause tremors to run through the capital markets, not in the kind of Trussageddon style of the previous Conservative ministry, but certainly it will cause concerns about, well, what's Labour going to do? And that's got to be taken into account, especially when you're so indebted. Like, debt was falling in 1964 when Labour came in, partly because of mild background inflation. Debt certainly is not falling now, although it's aimed to be by the end of the Parliament. So what are you going to do to comfort the markets, unlike 1975-76 under those Dennis Healey budgets as Chancellor as well? So that would be my first question. And we'll probably see some tax rises, more than, shall we say, is currently being advertised, to stabilise the fiscal position to do that. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? You'd normally think the markets would hate tax rises, but they might be quite comforted by tax rises in a medium range, because at least it shows realism. The second point I would make is that we want to keep as I said, our policy tourism away from the core of policy making, which is to say that it's all very well to have ideas from around the world, like a city like Houston in Texas has built a huge amount of houses and therefore house prices have stabilized. Well, that might not work entirely in a megalopolis like London, a vast European city which sucks in people from all around the world. House prices might not be stabilized just by building more in the grey parts of the green belt. And we've seen so many examples of this, like the Commissariat du Plan, which Labour tried to copy, or thought they were copying, in the mid-60s to the late 60s. And aforementioned Alec Cairncross, who was chief economic advisor, said, well, do you speak really good French? Have you lived in Paris? Have you worked at the plan? To which the answers were kind of no. And I think you need that really intimate knowledge of economic policy making. I've come across so many bad examples of this, which is, basically get an intern to write a script, a literature survey about Finnish schools, which is just not worth really doing unless you're then going to really get embedded in that policy. Third lesson of 4, I think, is your vague impressions are not going to really take you very far, and you need detailed policy. If we look at New Labour in power, it thought, coming in, we need targets to squeeze performance in the public sector, which of course is a key element of productivity. One of the reasons that productivity is low is that public services are in real crisis, some of them. Labour took a long time to realise that those targets would create lots of unintended consequences. So hospitals would run exactly to the target in A&E 4 hours, and then they would stop improving, which is absolutely reasonable. And we can see this in the university sector where we work all the time, but it's not necessarily good for performance above a certain level. And Labour then thought about performance in a much wider and I think more coherent way. And that might be the last lesson of the 4, which is just to give yourself time to think. There's this kind of Kennedy-esque view that we must do everything in 1,000 days, we must do everything quickly, that Harold Wilson copied in 64, the year after Kennedy's assassination, of course. But you don't need to do everything very quickly, and perhaps you should start small scale And Labour has announced a lot of small-scale things, partly because it doesn't have very much money. Because, for example, Labour came in 1964 and they talked a lot about economic, social, and industrial planning over a 5-year, a 10-year, and even a 25-year time cycle. I've been writing about the so-called very long-term plan recently, and they said, well, what should motorways look like in the 1980s? Very reasonable question, and you've got to have plans, as Cancross again said. However, by 1968, 69, there was very little left of the kind of linear, determined, X goes to Y type of planning, and planning had become something that looks a lot more like the Bank of England's fan diagram today. And Labour had to react. It held productivity conferences with industry. It thought about, clusters of high-tech engineering and aeronautics that would go along with Concorde, which they had to stick with. They tried to cancel, but they had to stick with in the end. So give yourself time and space to think about the fleet-footedness of that you'll need if circumstances very much change. So just to sum up, I think the main principles would be that time matters. You can't do everything quickly. You shouldn't try to do everything quickly. You should try to familiarize yourself with actual models of, for instance, technical clustering in the United States, a much richer country than most European countries. And you should think about your targets again and again and again. Attlee wanted productivity to surge by adopting Fordist methods, and it didn't really, because you can't adopt Fordist methods without thinking about the context of British industry for 100 years. I sound very Hobbes-Baumian and Marxist there, but you've got to fit it into the context. Cameron and Osborne wanted to cut government spending and do a kind of Clinton trick where borrowing costs would fall. And borrowing costs fell, but they didn't invest anything, so they missed off half the lesson, really. So just to sum up, politics matters a lot. So Reeves and Starmer will have perhaps more maneuverability, more room for maneuver than they think. Gordon Brown, even in the first 2 years when he adopted Kenneth Clarke's spending limits, he found 2 billion, 3 billion more for the NHS. Pretty soon you're talking serious money. However, there are hard constraints, which I've stressed in this very brief kind of introduction to our chat. And that is the most powerful force in the world, which is the bond markets. That is the appropriateness or otherwise of foreign or international mechanisms or kind of lessons. That is changing circumstances. And that is also just the reality of, for instance, political opposition. Like, I can guarantee that planning reform will be much harder than Labour thinks now. But that's 11 minutes, Michael. Sorry, but I've given that a good thrust, I hope.
That's great. Thank you so much, Glenn. I was just as you were talking, I was remembering the a phrase that I heard from Virginia Berridge, the historian, and it was that it's a complete myth that people aren't interested in history at decision-making like levels. She in fact said everyone has an interpretation of history as they enter an important job. She said a kind of folk history. It's a kind of and. I mean, it's hard to talk about a collective group of people and what is their collective interpretation of history, but just from the media and so on, people are constantly comparing, is it like the 1960s, 1997, 1906 was the one I heard yesterday. I mean, like what do you think is the collective kind of folk history interpretation of what a new government might be about to walk? What do they think it's similar to?
I think that they think it's a mix. So I don't think people are so naive, especially in the public policy making community, as to think it's quite simply one or the other. And there's a sense in which these models of, as you say, 1906, 1945, 1964, they're heuristics or kind of tools we take to thinking about what's different and what's similar. So no one thinks that it's exactly similar, but it's a little bit like Blair and 97 in that the public sector is clearly in a very low investment, low effort equilibrium. And that's really hammering, for instance, labour market entry, where if you've got a government that says you've got to work if you're sick, but you have to support people to work if you're sick. And we're losing people over 55 hand over fist out of the labour market. So they think it's like Blair, but I think, and Keir Starmer has actually, he sort of praised Wilson as his example, didn't he? They also think it's like Wilson, where you have to hold together a very vociferous party focused on how do you get to faster economic growth. Because the whole point of Wilsonism is we will apply science and technology, not just to industry, but to government, and we will get to more professional expertise, and we'll speed up the growth rate. Now, this sounds comical, from 3.5% to 4%. Now, we'd kill for 3.5% now, wouldn't we? But if Starmer's whole shtick is that we'll speed up growth from 1.5% to 1.75 to 2, that is a huge amount of extra public spending by the end of the parliament. I mean, I think my point about that would be that it takes you much longer to speed up growth than you think. And my example would be the last 2 years have seen house building permissions, planning permissions go down. There's at least a 2-year lag before house building will go up again. So I guess, history doesn't repeat itself. A.J.P. Taylor said, politicians they learn how to make new mistakes. When they study history, they just learn new errors. Now, I think that's a bit unfair. It's kind of Alan being waspish as usual, but brilliantly waspish. But history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So there are two kind of rhymes there.
Thank you, Glenn. Has anyone got any points they want to raise now? I've been emailed some questions, but does anyone want to raise anything now? You can raise the little hand, put it in the chat, or Glenn and I can talk some more while you think about it. I'll give you a second. Okay, so a question came in. Essentially, this is the year of democracy, 2024. There are governments being elected all over the place. But there are structural issues, aging populations, debt, you mentioned, national debts and so on. I know it's a grand question, Glenn, but like internationally, what can we add to this debate by using history?
Well, I mean, I think slightly against Eeyorish type, I think that there's a lesson that you shouldn't lose hope, because there's a temptation in the international policymaking community, a bit like the 1920s and 30s, although our challenges are not so bad as then, to have quite a morbid policymaking process where we can't, it's going to cost 50 billion over a parliament or two in the NHS to adapt to an aging population. We've got a huge debt stock, etc. So they're the two you mentioned. However, we've been here many, many times before. And in 1930-31, people said capitalism's finished, liberal democracy's finished. And we're going to have a much more autocratic, autarkic capitalism. And perhaps even the banking system will have to be permanently nationalized. There'll have to be capital and credit controls permanently. And that's just the way the world's going. And that's how we'll meet the fascist and the communist challenge. And of course, 1940 is a whole different level of public policy challenge that we assuredly don't face. So, and in 1962-63, in that recession that helps to lead to Labour coming back to office, and also in the early 90s after Black Wednesday, there's a huge amount of literature saying this recession could be permanent and structural. So, for instance, in the 30s, people said, well, middle class has got a car, has got a radio. Consumption might fall in a secular manner. In the 1960s, people said, well, maybe in the late 1960s, people said, well, maybe technological innovation could be played out and our capital productivity increases might be plateauing. And lo and behold, you get to the late 1980s and you get the internet and you get the web, and you get lots of people saying the opposite, which is that you've got infinite capital productivity gains. So I think my first lesson is that history doesn't have a gloomy face. History's actually got a more optimistic face, because if we look at the falling cost of solar power, or if we look at potential falling cost of small nuclear power sites, we could be on the brink of another turn of the wheel where we become a bit more optimistic again. It won't take long at 2% growth of 2 parliaments of Labour in office, which they might get, to say that there's a current surplus. And actually we can invest in the NHS in the way that we will need. It won't take very long to say, well, how do we work social care differently to take the pressure off the NHS, which is what we really need. What we've got in the NHS is a backing into it of a channel that doesn't work and can't work. And lots of people watching this will have elderly parents or grandparents who can't be put in any social care or can't get any social care at home. And then the NHS starts to back up. So I guess I'm slightly against personality type. I think I'm an optimist on these matters.
Thanks, Glenn. I'm really pleased to hear this. Anyone got any points to Glenn? I do have some more, but it'd be great to hear any sectoral ones as well. We've got several policy specialists from specific sectors. Okay. I was also someone emailed, but this one on what I would call kind of attitudes to politics generally. You mentioned the 1930s. Absolutely. I mean, you know, the idea that the future is democratic was really faltering at best in the 30s. Like I, what is the question was, it was, you know, have political attitudes changed substantially over time, really? Or is it just a bit negative, a bit positive, and we're in one of the sort of parts of the cycle right now?
I would say that we're in one part of the cycle, but this cycle seems deeper and more acute. And the reason for that, as a good post-Marxist again, is I think probably material, which is that you can't have 15 years to 20 years of no wage growth net in a secular manner and not have outbursts of discontent, firstly. And also, you can't have being on the edge of a very dangerous world in terms of increased migration flows without having some discontent about the increase in migration since the 1990s, I suppose. Now, in Britain, we experienced those in a rather watery fashion. So you would say that Reform UK and the Brexit Party and the UKIP that in some ways they grow out of are rather a mild reflection, although still a right populist reflection of this trend. And we don't see the young people going over to the right beyond conservatism, as we do, for instance, perhaps in France, where these phenomena are more acute. But I think that, number one, that no wage growth at all is historically unprecedented in the modern age. And I'm actually surprised that discontent is not higher, and young people aren't out there rioting more. That's not an incentive. That's not me saying they should riot. But let's face it, a marginal tax rate, if you add your student loan in the UK, in England, to perhaps a 45% tax rate and an 8% national insurance rate, is approaching 2/3 of your income if you're a high earner. And you're young and you can't afford a house and you probably can't afford a car plus its insurance. So what's the promise of capitalism to you that was the promise of capitalism to my mum and dad in 1964 when they bought their first house? That's just a personal reflection. Hopefully my mum won't watch this on that. But so, you know, if wages don't rise, then there will be discontent. I also think that immigration, although my own grandfather was a migrant from Northern Ireland, and I'm personally, like lots of semi-liberal metropolitans, generally personally in favour of migration. You can't have net migration yearly 750,000 in a country that has been historically a huge net exporter of people until the 1990s, without exposing a great deal of worry and concern about immigration. And remember that Britain has already experienced two immigrations since 1945 that were rather large and absorbed them with tension, but also with some success. So this is the third burst of migration, just as Britain was kind of historically settling down to think about the other two migrations since 1945. So I guess this is a turn of the tumbler. I've got like a medieval peasant's view of this, which is the world will turn and it will turn up again. And remember, migration will go down because of the Ukraine scheme will hopefully run out, and the Hong Kong scheme will run down in terms of people who want to come to Britain. They're the two biggest parts of the schemes. So perhaps tension will be relieved. But this is I think worse than some of the discontent that we experienced, you know, late 60s about migration or stagnating wages.
Thank you, Glenn. Some very grand topics. We've got a question here from Catherine Webb of Imperial College. It actually relates to a different seminar we did with somebody else. So the question says, what can history tell us about how to deal with the potential challenges of the development of generative AI? I would actually, if I could sharpen this question, I'm aware that in certain government policy making civil service circles, people are hoping somehow AI will lead to some large productivity gain. And that's where the secret to economic growth can come from without accumulating more debt. What do you think of all of this, Glenn?
Well, the first thing is I'm not very well up on AI, so the specifics I'm not very well up on, and I need to be better informed on. Partly because we need to detect this amongst our students' essays, for one thing, apart from any others in this just finished marking season. But what I think about this is that we've had many of these big MacGuffins before. They remind me of that big kind of alien slab in 2001, right? Which is that we're supposed to think that this is the plug-in answer. Whereas actually, I think we as historians have come to see technology as the social learning that is around the physical technology. And I'll give you an example of what I mean, which is that the steam engine, which transforms the world, possibly in a way that AI will transform the world, takes probably 150 years to do so. From the Newcomen engine, pumping out water from your tin mine in Cornwall, to the double screw compressed propeller taking you across the Atlantic in those big passenger ships in the Edwardian era. Technology is also about its adaptation, its understanding, and its use. And I think we really just don't know where AI is going. I think we're just at the very beginnings of it. It may be that we look back and we see Rishi Sunak's attempt to seize the convening and leadership role in AI as one of the legacies of his premiership, because there's always this revisionist swing, isn't there? In 20 years, we'll all say, oh, what did Rishi Sunak do well? Well, he tried to ban smoking and he chaired the AI safety conference. Well, that's not bad in some ways. It might be thicker than David Cameron's legacy. So what I think my answer, too long don't read, is my answer is that we've got to be very cautious about believing that there's a plug-in that solves productivity, because Wilson thought that communication satellites, hovercrafts, and computers would be the answer to productivity, and they were, but they took 25 years to be so in some ways.
Thank you, Glenn. I actually, unless anyone's got a point, please do raise it if you do. And we're assuming that, we've got one, that Labour are going to win and therefore the Conservatives were going to lose. What lessons from history, if the Conservatives do lose in 12 days' time when we're recording this, what lessons from history will they take? Because the reason I ask is because the Conservative Party, is very broad. It has a left and a right, I'll put it that way. And we've seen what to me is the strengthening of the right of the Tory party. I mean, which way do you think the Tory party is going to go if it loses?
Well, I think this is a terrible academics answer, but it depends. It depends. It depends on how many seats they can preserve. If they've got 150 to 200 seats left, they may chug on as the kind of broad church you're talking about, from One Nation people all the way through to Suella Braverman and her allies on the right, and they'll be mightily relieved right now. We can look back on this in 12 days' time and see what we think, but they'll be mightily relieved if they can hold on to 200 seats. If they're completely smashed, more than they were in 1906, which is possible, but perhaps at the moment right now in flux, I think there's lots of voters who are mulling it over. Then I think that history has a warning, which is that parties can die, because they will be like the Liberals in the 1920s, because of the money that will stop coming to the Conservative Party. With short money will stop coming, the money the taxpayer gives them, and the donors will dry up, because who's going to give money to 100 seats? Understandably. Then that's what happened to the Liberals in the 1920s, with all the controversies over the chest, the Lloyd George war chest that it was called, or where all the donors' money would go. Then you could see Conservatives defecting on one side to the Lib Dems and on the other side to Reform. So the Conservative Party could be like ripped in two with these two black holes on either side of it. So it really depends on how many seats they've got. Probably base case, they're somewhere in between those two cases, is that they go to the right, because that's what they usually do. That's what they did with Hague and IDS, although of course William Hague was a much more impressive figure than he appeared to be at the time, better, more deep thinker. And that's what they did after 64, although they went to the free market right under Heath between 65 and 70, the Selsdon Man kind of proto-Thatcherism right. So I think it's likely, like Labour under Corbynism, because we live in an era of membership-driven parties, that they will strongly go to the right and they will try to steal reform's clothes while they were bathing, to use Disraeli's phrase. So they will say, we'll pull out of European Convention on Human Rights. We might have a referendum on the death penalty. We might have net zero migration, or these elements that they think will buy off reform. Now, I think that's a terrible error, because as you feed the wolf just gets stronger. But as not a member of the Conservative Party, I guess it's not for me to say.
Thank you very much, Glenn. We've got just enough time for a question. We've got one from Catherine Webb. Does anyone else want to intervene at this stage? Yes. David Yates says, it would be interesting to hear your historical perspective on the place of local government and regional policy around industrial and infrastructure strategy. And we have 2 minutes, Glenn, so please make it efficient. Thanks.
Well, the first thing is that I think it will be a new kind of regional policy that comes in under Labour, that new Labour was reaching towards, and that to a certain extent Mandelson and Vince Cable did bring in, which is that regional policy will be much stronger hubs, and you'd expect me to say this, possibly centred to some extent around universities. We've just got a report out from Katie Shaw and Connected Communities, Arts and Humanities Research Council, in the last couple of days about what could universities do in the region. I think there will be much stronger regional government under Labour, and I think that's a very good thing. I've written about this quite a few times, and there will be critically simpler regional government under Labour, because we've made a kind of chaotic mess in England, and in Wales and Scotland. There isn't the regional tier that I think we do probably need. So I'm very much in favour of that. One example would be, despite my anti-policy tourism stance, it would be city borrowing for urban transport infrastructure. A city like Leeds, a city like Bristol require a tram system. And if they were in France or the Nordics, they would have a tram system. And it would mean you would go into work much more, and you wouldn't be just 3 miles away, but it'd take you an hour and a half to get there. So I think there will be much more regional policy. And that's something structural Labour could do that might not cost a lot at the centre to begin with, of course, as well.
Thanks, Glenn. Has anyone got a final point they want to raise? If not, I think, well, thank you so much, Glenn. There's a lot to think about in there for all of us. But you have come out, if we go through this and write a list of things Glenn thinks we should do in 2 weeks, there's doable stuff in there, right? And that's really great. I was really hoping that you'd come out with some things like that, and I'm sure our audience has gained a lot. So stay in touch, everyone. Thank you again to Professor Glen O'Hara, and look forward to seeing you at future events. Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.